Oh, you caught me again. Just eating some of my chocolate. Chocolate fudged Oreos. Good. We were talking about lesson 103 on food, and that some foods the Europeans never knew for thousands of years until Columbus went to America, until the French and the Dutch and the English and the Spanish brought these things from the new land just to test out, see if the Europeans would like them. And man, they like them. Well, chocolate, I told you about chocolate. The Aztecs and the Mayas, they made this chocolate from these cacao beans. And you would call them cocoa beans maybe. But they made this chocolate, and it was very, very bitter. But when they tasted it, they thought, put a little bit of honey with this. They thought, this is pretty good. And so even when the Aztec hosted Montezuma hosted the conquistadors that came at Cortez's time, he fed them some chocolate. And they were like, wow, I never tasted this ever before. And they kind of liked it. So they brought it back, and that's where the royalty and then the kings and the queens, they started mixing it with their honey and their sugar, and then it became popular. The Spanish raised chocolate and came to raise chocolate in Ecuador in 1635. The English came to Jamaica, and of course they brought slaves, some of them, both the Spanish and the English, to work in their fields. But also in Jamaica they had chocolate. The French came to Brazil and Martinique and the Dominican Republic, and they started growing chocolate. They found out that chocolate would only grow in some areas, like 10 degrees north and south of the equator. So it had to be pretty warm to raise these cacao beans. But they became a novelty, didn't they? So we start thinking of these different kind of things, but also the Native Americans hadn't tasted some of the food that was brought from Europe either. And so we go, some of them, the food around the world that's so popular, one of the foods around the world is rice. Rice was grown in China and India before Jesus was born. And the Africans, right after, probably in the 1st century AD, had rice. And the Muslims brought rice to Spain in 700 AD. And then they later, that century, they grew rice in Italy. The Spanish brought rice to the Caribbean in South America, where they never heard of rice, in the late 1400s, probably about the time of Columbus. The English colonists then grew rice in the 1600s, and rice became the top export crop in the Carolinas in America. Just around the 1700s, rice got all the way around the world. Oh, then we have wheat. You guys eat a lot of wheat, like bread, yeah. Tortillas, all these things are wheat. Well, wheat was really unknown except in the old world in Europe. Wheat didn't, the Native Americans didn't know much about wheat. But wheat was grown a long time ago, because we find wheat in the Bible. We find bread in the Bible. We find in Abraham's time that they grew wheat. And it was a major crop in Europe. They kind of survived on wheat there in some areas. But Columbus, we know, brought wheat to America. And the Spanish brought wheat to Mexico and Argentina, where they grew it, and into the southwestern United States. They grew wheat. The Dutch and the Swedes brought wheat to New Amsterdam, which we know later on was changed to New York when England took over the Dutch colony. The Dutch also brought it to New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. The Dutch were really into raising different kinds of food, and they were interested in the Native Americans and what food and what kind of things they had, and that they could exchange food with. It's kind of sad, but the Dutch were very inventive, especially when it came to new food recipes. So let's see. Oh, coffee. Native Americans didn't know about coffee at all because coffee actually was first planted in Ethiopia in Africa. And now it's one of the most valuable crops in the whole world. You know, it happened that in Ethiopia out there when they were raising, had these goats, and they realized that goats were eating these plants and the goats would not be able to sleep at night. So they thought, what are they eating? And they found out they were eating this plant that had coffee in it. And so then the monks came in and they shared this with the monks. And so the monks thought, oh, I am really getting tired at night because we have to stay up almost all night for these nightly prayers. And I keep falling asleep and start snoring. It's troublesome, you know. The head friar might get mad if I fall asleep during prayer. So they took a little bit of this coffee and they thought, wow, it keeps you awake. Then they could stay awake during the prayer time. Well, the first coffee was cultivated in, in Arabia, then in Persia, then in Egypt, then in Syria. They had coffee houses. Have you ever had Turkish coffee? It's really strong. I had some in Petra in the Jordan area, and I'm like, oh, no thank you. It's a little strong for me. But that's where they actually cultivated coffee in the Muslim areas. In 1600, it was brought to Europe. And then in Europe, the Pope actually thought first, I think this is an evil drink. I don't think anybody should be drinking this. And so they had to drink coffee in secret for a while. And then suddenly the Pope, he thought, this coffee kind of helps me stay awake so that I can pray at night too. So Pope Clement in 1615 said, it's okay, you can drink some coffee if you like. So then it became popular in Austria and England and France and Germany and Holland and the Dutch again. It took coffee to India. They tried to raise it in Indonesia, which it failed. And then the Dutch brought it to America, to New Amsterdam. And then they started growing coffee to export from America. We look back and we're going to be studying a guy named King Louis XIV of France. He was really into coffee. And so when they brought the coffee back from Brazil and such, he loved it. He had tons of coffee. That's like in the late 1600s. Well, coffee became popular a long time ago. And tea. Oh, let's talk about tea a little bit, huh? Tea. Well, tea was grown in ancient times. Where? Can you guess? China. Have you ever seen these Chinese little tea sets? Well, anyway, China. The Emperor Shennong was sitting beneath a tree, and someone was boiling some water. A servant was boiling some water, and they used to boil water then to disinfect it so they couldn't drink. And some leaves fell into the water, and they cooked them up, and so he decided to taste them. They're pretty good. They were tea leaves. That's the saying, how it happened. So it was popular in the Tang Dynasty. In fact, they found tea containers in the Han Dynasty in 206 BC. That's a long time ago. Then the Japanese monks brought tea to Japan, and it went like everyone drank tea in Japan. And then the Portuguese traders, who we know came to Japan, in the 1500s, they started drinking the tea, and so of course they brought it to Europe. In Europe, the Dutch brought Chinese tea to sell. In 1606, it spread like wildfire. Everyone wanted a little drink tea, you know. And there was the first tea house in London in 1658. And in the colonies, they brought this tea, and they needed the tea. In fact, when you'll find in American history, when the English started taxing the tea, they got awful mad. Really mad. They didn't want anyone to tax their tea, for goodness sakes. You can look in history books about that subject. Another thing we have is sugar. Well, sugar was a sweetener for a long time, but first in the Bible it talks about honey, that's sweeter than honey. They used honey to sweeten things. In Genesis 43, Jacob took honey as a gift to the Egyptians. Honeybees were not a native to North America. So we know the Native Americans didn't have honey. In 1622, the English brought honeybees. They wanted to start making honey in America. Honey, honey. Sugarcane. The ancient peoples, they had sugar and molasses. In the South Pacific, they grew it before the time of Jesus. Alexander the Great had sugar and brought sugar into Pakistan in 326 BC. China grew sugarcane in 100 BC at least, and the Europeans in 636 AD knew about sugar and liked sugar. Sugar was very expensive in Europe. Only the wealthy could probably have sugar, and only in small amounts, because sugar wasn't a common thing, and they really didn't know how to grow it really in large quantities. But Columbus brought some cuttings to America, and the climate in the Caribbean became ideal for growing sugar. Sugar cane. The Spanish, starting with Columbus's son, worked to establish sugar plantations in America. And the English and the Spanish and the French brought slaves from Africa to work in these great big sugar plantations. Sugar became popular all over the world, and in the Americas too. In fact, a lot of Native Americans have sugar diabetes because really they weren't used to sugar for years and years. So when the sugar came, they ate too much of it, I think, and they were predisposed to sugar diabetes. Now that's a theory. So the last thing I was going to talk about, I think this is the last thing, is sorghum. Sorghum was indigenous to Africa, and they found sorghum in a lot of different things, and it makes a sweet syrup, and many forms. It comes in rice, porridge, oatmeal, flatbread, popcorn-like, or all kinds of sorghum. It was grown in Assyria before Christ, and then the Chinese grew it in the 1200s, but it came to America in 1600s. Sorghum is something they used to feed their animals. It became so popular, and they also made syrup from sorghum that was pretty delicious. So those are some that were represented in your book. I know there's plenty of others, but don't you think it's neat that God made all these varieties of food, and then he made us have such wonderful taste buds to taste the food? So amazing. But he wanted us not to eat in excess, didn't he? But isn't it wonderful that God knows exactly what we like? Even chocolate. Chocolate covered Oreos. The best.